Hi, I'm Daniel Treisman. I'm a professor of political science at UCLA and a visiting fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. And I'm also the author of a book just out called The Return, Russia's Journey from Gorbachev to Medvedev, which looks like this.
Yeah, and my name is Krastev. I'm a political scientist, Bulgarian. I'm director of the Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia and permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. And now I have just the pleasure of finishing Daniel's book.
Okay, and today we're going to be talking about Russian politics, Putin and Medvedev, who's in control, why are they so popular, what kind of political regime is there in Russia, and is it approaching a crisis, what can we expect going forward. But I want to start by talking about U.S.-Russian relations, and in particular about an article in the journal Foreign Affairs that I just wrote along with Andrei Schleifer. And the title of the article is Why Moscow Says No, a Question of Russian Interests, Not Psychology. And in this article, Andrei and I take issue with a common assumption in Washington, we believe, that whenever the Russian leaders don't support U.S. policies around the world, it's because of wounded pride or resentment at their lost superpower status or some other kind of psychological complexes or pathologies. So, for instance, when NATO expands up to its borders and the Russians object strongly, that's taken as a sign of paranoia or hysteria. Well, psychology is obviously important in international relations, as it is in life in general, but we think there's a simpler explanation for why the Russians haven't been more helpful. And that's just that they don't think that U.S. policies are in Russia's interest, or else they share the goals, but they think the U.S. strategy is not going to work. And as a result, they're not willing to pay significant costs to support an approach that they think is going to fail. So, and in the article, we look at what we think the U.S. and the Russian leaders consider their national interest to be at this point, and we come to the conclusion that there's really very little overlap. There aren't many things that the U.S. really has to offer Russia that Russia really cares about at this point. Now, that doesn't mean we have to panic. The relationship can still be cooperative, although limited, so long as we don't miss the opportunities for limited cooperation because we're too busy psychoanalyzing the Russians. And finally, in the longer term, we see some reason to be a little bit more optimistic, and that is that Russia is gradually integrating into Europe. We see this in the travel statistics and the number of Russians who are studying abroad, the business ties, the Russians buying companies, real estate, and so on in Europe, and in various kinds of cultural exchanges. And although that doesn't imply that Russia is necessarily going to develop in a more democratic direction, there's no guarantee that it will converge with the West. We think there's a better chance of that given this kind of integration than if Russia were to remain isolated or else turn in the opposite direction and concentrate on integrating into Asia. So that in a nutshell is the argument we present, and Ivan, I'm very interested to hear what you think about it.
Thanks a lot. Of course, I'm going to be the one that should try to take the defense of psychologists and those who are trying to psychologize what's going on there. But first, there's three things on which I want to agree immediately. I do believe that many have been using this psychoanalytical discourse with respect to Russia in a certain way to try to re-justify policies which, I agree with you, does not necessarily meet Russia's understanding of their interests. Here I do believe that Carl Schmitt made a very valuable observation when he said that victorious power normally are losing curiosity. And when I'm going to basically defend a much more psychological or experience-based approach with respect to Russia, my argument is the following. You're right. Russia is a much more normal country than most of its critics or some of its admirers wants to believe. You do not need to believe in the soul school, that everything is about the mystery of Russian soul, or about the oil school and to explain everything in terms of oil in order to understand Russia. But I do believe that if you want really to understand where Russia stands and especially how Russia is going to respond to one policy or the other, you should not avoid psychology, and especially you should not avoid Russia's experience in the last 20 years, and especially the collective experience of the people that are running Russia. And here we have 3 or 4 interesting things to be taken, in my view, seriously. The first is the collapse of the Soviet Union is not just an accident that is not going to affect the elites. I do believe that when Russia is deciding what is in its national interest or not national interest, basically this is very much based on certain perceptions of the world, and it's also based on a certain rationalization of what happened to them. And here I do believe that Russia is very much, and Russian elites became very much experts on fragility. Unlike China and some other players that have a different interest with the United States, I do believe that Russia tends to perceive the world as more insecure and much more fragile than others, and this is very much based in this experience. So I'll claim that there is very much this type of psychological insecurity that is shaping Russian foreign policy action and Russian foreign policy thinkings. But when I'm talking about this insecurity and when I'm talking about Russia being driven by fears, I do believe it's a real fears. I don't believe that simply the Russians are paranoid. From time to time they could be, and on certain issues they are. But there are, in my view, 3 things that make them more insecure than others. One is their borders. And I do believe that neither the Russian elite nor the Russian population can be sure that the process of disintegration that started with the disintegration of the Soviet Union has been reversed. Stephen Kotkin once said that Russia inherited all the causes for the collapse of the Soviet Union plus the collapse itself. The second, in my view, type of insecurity comes also from the very success of the Putin regime of these years, because this success was very much based on the jump also of the oil and gas prices. But the oil and gas prices are one of the things that Russian elite cannot control. So this important insecurity, the huge and multi-ethnic and multi-religious nature of the Russian state, the very weak identity of the current Russian state, I do believe all of them make Russia much more vulnerable than others, and from this point of view, much more unpredictable than the others. So when I agree with you that Russia is quite rational, defending certain interests of hers against the American propositions, I do believe that any good politician also should keep in mind that from time to time Russia could be much more unpredictable than they expect.
That's interesting, Ivan, because I'm not sure that I see this unpredictability in practice. And I do agree that there are objective reasons for Russians to feel more insecure than other countries, although insecurity is becoming an increasingly salient aspect of the modern world as countries' economies become more globalized. But the Russians are, as you say, particularly dependent on the exports of oil and gas and the prices of oil and gas, which they don't control. And geopolitically, they have these enormous borders, multi-ethnic population, and a continuing civil war in the North Caucasus, a low-grade civil war, a terrorist threat. So they have reasons to be insecure, and I'm not sure that I see that as something that necessarily belongs in the sphere of psychology, although I agree with your point that perhaps they overreact at times, or they feel this insecurity even more intensely than the objective reality would indicate. But to get back to the question of unpredictability, what actions do you see Russia having taken in the last 10, 20 years that can't be explained in terms of relatively stable long-run interests and conceptions?
I'm just going to give two examples, which in my view basically will try to defend my argument. One is Russia's war with Georgia, and the other is its position on WTO. And here is where my interpretation comes up. It's not that Russia could be blamed for the war in Georgia, but what was very much interesting was why Russia did what it did, and especially why it decided to recognize South Ossetia and Abkhazia. If you follow the Russian policy before the war, you can see that non-recognition of South Ossetia and Abkhazia was extremely important for Russia. First, because this is allowing Russia to keep itself as somebody who is defending a principle, and this was very much part of the role that it was trying to play with respect to the Kosovo conflict in the Balkans. It was also very important because any type of recognition of a small state as a result of separatist move could create a major problem for Russia itself, where places like Chechnya and others, you have forces that have been very much moving in this direction. So if you see the behavior of Russia and also the position of the Russian foreign ministry, you can expect that Russia was really not interested to recognize South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Of course, they have been interested to keep them outside of Georgia, but not to go with the legal recognition. What happened in the days after the war, and I do believe here it's very important where overreaction comes. You have the Russian state, for which it was a reputation game. They should show that they're not weak, that there's certain red lines that they're not going to allow anybody to cross. So the Russian foreign policy wanted to show that they have succeeded, and basically wanted to show that they're ready to do more than and different than others expected, and they came with this recognition, which in fact turned against them, because Russia is still very much isolated when it comes to the South Ossetia and Abkhazia issue. It was a major diplomatic defeat, exactly because it was unpredictable, it was unprepared. The second is WTO, and I do believe that here perception is extremely important. Of course, there was voices for and against WTO, but there was a feeling that Russia has made its mind that they want to be part of the WTO. Then the crisis of 2008 came, and here comes my argument. Russia tends to believe that Putin is really more fragile even than it is. So Russia basically decided that it's the end of globalization, that probably what is going to come up is much more regional trading blocks, and for them it was very important to have a trading bloc of its own. So they moved out of the WTO and gave this preference to the custom union with Kazakhstan and Belarus. In my view, this is unpredictability, and this unpredictability is very much based on this vulnerability, on this experience with crisis that they have for the last 20 years.
Let's take both of those examples. So to start with the Georgia War, and just to review the events, I think everybody agrees now that what happened was that in August 2008, Georgian forces started shelling Tskhinvali, the capital of South Ossetia, and then the Russians sent in troops to defend South Ossetia and simultaneously sent troops into Abkhazia, another disputed territory within Georgia. Now, perhaps this was unpredictable, took by surprise the Georgians. Perhaps it was unpredictable for them, but it wasn't unpredictable, I think, for many other observers, because Russia had made security commitments. It had pledged itself to defend the South Ossetians and the Abkhazians against any attempt to reincorporate them into Georgia by force. And given that, I think it was something that any major power that had made such commitments would do, to follow through and to go in and to defend. Russia would have felt that it had lost reputation. I think the U.S. in similar cases would also have been concerned about its reputation. But as I hear you, Ivan, you're not saying that the Russian intervention itself was unpredictable so much as the subsequent recognition of South Ossetia and Abkhazia as independent states. And I'm ready to agree that that was a mistake. The Russians apparently thought that more countries would follow, and it ended up being quite embarrassing. They got the support of Nicaragua and the Pacific island of Nauru, but it stopped at about that. So, yes, it looks like an international mistake. I'm certainly not arguing, Andre and I in the article are certainly not arguing that the Russians don't make mistakes. In fact, we think they've made rather a lot of them. But nevertheless, there are these underlying interests which seem to direct where they're going. Now, on the second issue, the WTO, and just to review what happened again, Russia has been trying to get into the World Trade Organization for decades now. I think the negotiations go back to 93 or 94. And it has got steadily closer and closer, but there has always been one more obstacle in the way, it seemed, at least it seemed to Moscow. During the international financial crisis, the intensity with which the Russians were pursuing WTO membership was reduced. Now, why was that the case? I would say it was because the countervailing interests became somewhat more significant during the crisis. The Russians were very concerned about losing jobs, unemployment in certain sectors, in particular the automobile sector, car manufacturers. And that's a sector that would be very much hurt by WTO membership. Other sectors would benefit a lot from it, such as steel, but car manufacturing would be hurt. And so I think the interests pushing for entry and against entry were always somewhat balanced, and the crisis sort of pushed against it. And then I think that is actually a case where I think Putin personally got emotional about foreign policy and decided that he just wasn't going to put up with all this, as he saw it, stalling on the Western side for irrelevant reasons. But then they came back and re-entered the negotiation, backtracked on the demand that Kazakhstan and Belarus enter at the same point.
My major argument here is not going to be so much a disagreement, but I do believe that when we look backwards, everything is very much rational. And it's not a problem to rationalize any type of policy decisions. But when you're trying to predict, the basic problem is to what extent this is just this type of a classical realist thinking that is shaping Russian foreign policy, and to what extent, and I'm saying this not in a negative way, we're not talking about wounded pride and things like this, but simply the fact that the Russian elites have a very particular history. I think the successor of one of the superpowers that fall down quite unexpectedly over the weeks, and this experience of instability and this basically very important personal experience that follow these people are pushing them to react in a way that is different, for example, than the Chancellor of Austria, if he's going to take these decisions, not because he's less or more emotional, but because of this different type of experience that shaped him. For me, this is my major argument why psychology, but not psychology understand as tractates on the mystery of the Russian soul and things like this should enter in, because otherwise, from time to time, I do believe we can decide to, or we can misread some of the decision of the Russian leadership.
Right. Okay. Well, I think we agree on a lot with regard to this. The psychology matters, and past experience shapes psychology. The question is, how much, to what extent is distinctive psychology necessary to explain how Russia's behaved in the world? I think on that we disagree a little. But let's move on to another question, which is what should U.S. foreign policy towards Russia be? And starting from my perspective, that Russia is motivated by a certain conception of its national interests, and also that there's at this point very little overlap between the U.S. international priorities and Russia's international priorities. It seems to me that the U.S. has to work quite hard at identifying areas in which there is an overlap, where some kind of limited agreement that's beneficial to both sides can be negotiated, and maintaining channels of communication so that we have those conversations that identify those very important but limited areas of common purpose or common interests. And I think obviously it's also important that we stand up for the basic principles that we believe in, that the Russians, all countries should be democratic, that people should have their human rights respected. But at the same time, I think we can, in parallel, try to identify mutually beneficial limited agreements. And we've seen a pragmatic approach in the last couple of years on the part of the Obama administration, and that's yielded some important steps forward, such as the New START Treaty, the Russian support for a UN resolution tightening sanctions on Iran, and so on. They're limited steps, but very important ones. And so I would hope to see more of the same.
My position is not going to be much different. If I'm reading you right, you're saying that the United States should be pragmatic, and the other side, they should be minimalist. I mean, they should moderate their expectations, that even if they're going to be pragmatic, you cannot expect much because there is a major divergence of interests.
Exactly.
Here, I do believe that we're in agreement, but of course, part of the reading of your position could be, if the United States cannot achieve much in its relations with Russia, why to put much an effort in this? And I do believe that at the moment what the Obama administration is doing, I do believe that they understood, in my view, rightly, what is the major dilemma which the Russian foreign policy basically is facing. And the dilemma is that on one level, especially globally, Russia is a status quo power. Russia is part of all the major global institutions. Russia is overrepresented when it have in mind its economic power, its political power, not its military power, it's still very powerful. So as a result of it, Russia can only lose out of redistribution of power in the world, which is not going to go in their direction. On the other side, I mean emotionally, Russia is much more resentful to the post-Cold War status quo, because for it was a time of decline, it was a time of call it humiliation or things like this, but basically Russia was part of status. So I do believe that here Obama is playing a pragmatic game, but also symbolic game. First, he decided to treat Russia as a global power, not as European power. So all these difficult relations about Ukraine, about Georgia, he told the European, listen, this Europe, it's between European Union and Russia. It's not about us. We're interested in Iran, we're interested in Afghanistan, and things like this. I do believe, and here probably I'm less optimistic than you, that exactly because of the fact that the United States cannot achieve much with Russia, and because Russia is not as important economically or in strategic terms that it used to be to the United States, there is a real risk that the American-Russian policy can become much more domestic political game than a real foreign policy, because Russia is still symbolically very important in the United States domestic politics. Russia is one of the few countries that people know quite about. They know who is the president, they know even who is the prime minister. And from this point of view, I do believe that because American domestic politics is so polarized these days, I'm not going to be surprised if, especially now, the Republicans decided to use attack on the reset policy as one of their major foreign policy issues, and this is going to change very much the relations between the United States and Russia, because for the moment, at least in my reading, there is not a foreign policy consensus in the United States what the United States should do or can expect from its relations with Russia.
Yes, well, we'll see how that plays out. There's certainly a danger that Russia will become a political football, that everybody will be trying to score points. And I think clearly the Republicans at this juncture would like to resist any Obama administration policy that looks like it's going to succeed. But on the other hand, Russia, although it's hard to get Russia's agreement, and it's been a problem, there are issues on which Russia's help is really important. And in particular, if we think about North Korea and Iran, getting UN resolutions to impose sanctions or try to deal with their nuclear programs in some other way, Russia has a veto in the UN Security Council, so it's critical. fighting the war in Afghanistan against the Taliban. At this point, NATO is supplying its troops in part through Russia, and that agreement was very important. And one can go on. There's a whole series of issues on which Russia could contribute. Now, it's not easy to get Russia to do what the U.S. wants, because the U.S. doesn't have that much to offer that Russia wants. But nevertheless, I think Obama can point to these issues and ask the Republicans, look, do you really want to have to supply the NATO troops in Afghanistan only through Pakistan, as we used to be doing, and with all the problems that were involved in that?
But at the same time, on the Russian side, if you're right, as I told you, I tend to agree that the strategic importance of the relationship has declined. At the same time, the symbolic level of the relationship is still important. So in Russia itself, now when China and Europe are much more the economic and political priorities, and the Russian well-being and also the well-being of its elites much more depends on this. And when you have a regime which needs a symbolic support and which made quite a lot of its popularity based on the fact that, in Putin's words, Russia was getting out of its knees, anti-Americanism also has a political price. So in the way Russia can become a domestic football in the United States can become domestic football in Russia. And this is very much seen basically on any type of overreaction that the Russian leadership is going to get. And also, if there are going to be a major tensions between Putin and Medvedev camp, I do believe that there are going to be a strong temptation, for example, on the Putin side, to try to portray Medvedev as the American candidate, which with the idea that it's not going to help him much.
Well, great. So this brings us to the next topic, Medvedev and Putin. Who's really in control, and why are they so popular?
Okay, let's start here. First of all, I do believe that part of the problem with Russia is that we are perceiving Russia as more centralized, and that much more somebody is in control than it in reality is. I do believe that weak statehood is a major characteristic of Russia. Of course, Putin is at the moment much more powerful than Medvedev is. He has his constituency, especially in the provincial Russia. Obviously, there is his voters, he has his team, he has his people being placed here and there, he has huge money behind him. But I do believe that nevertheless that he is in control with and much stronger with respect to Medvedev. There is a situation in which Medvedev should not be simply taken for granted. My personal estimation is going to be that nevertheless that everybody talks about how problematic Pandem is, there is a real divide in the Russia political elite. And there is a very strange consensus in Russia. Everybody is going to agree on two things that don't go easily together. One is that there is not alternative to Putinism, but the second is that Putinism does not work. And I do believe that this type of two things in which the Russian elite believes end up with a situation in which we have two camps. We have the Putin camp and we have the Medvedev camp. The only thing that we don't know is to which camp Medvedev personally belongs.
Well, I agree with some of that, but when we talk about two camps and splits in the Russian Russian ruling circles, I'm a skeptic. Everybody in the last year or so has been claiming to see a struggle behind the scenes between Putin and Medvedev, and I think that's largely illusory. They're part of the same team. They have the same formative experience in the last 20 years, much of that time working together. They have the same interests, the same strategic vision. And if Medvedev wanted to strike out on his own and do something that Putin didn't like, it would be almost impossible for him to do so. If one just looks at what powers he holds. Everybody talks about this Russian constitution with this enormously strong presidency, but in current conditions, suppose Medvedev wants to pass a law. Well, he has to go to the Russian parliament, and the Russian parliament is dominated by the United Russia Party, which is led by Vladimir Putin. If Medvedev wants to implement something through this state, well, he has to go to the government. And who's the head of the government? Prime Minister Vladimir Putin. Suppose Medvedev wants to get rid of Putin, replace him as prime minister. Well, then he has the constitutional right to do that, but then he has to get the parliament to approve his replacement. And again, the parliament dominated by United Russia. So it's hard to see what powers Medvedev really has, other than certain appointment powers, which in practice have been exercised with Putin's consent and oversight, and also the power to give speeches, which Medvedev certainly does have. Now, I think, though, that in fact they're on the same page, and the reasons that sometimes there appears to be a conflict really comes down to public relations. They have these two roles to play, which diverge. Medvedev is appealing to the more modern, sophisticated, cosmopolitan groups, mostly in Moscow and St. Petersburg, the educated elites. And Putin is, as you say, Ivan, appealing to the provinces, to ordinary Russians across the country who tend to be more nationalistic, suspicious of the West, and so on. And as a result, the two of them sometimes say things which sound quite different and which even conflict. But I think it's not a sign of some bitter struggle behind the scenes, as some people imply, but rather just that they're appealing to these different groups. Now, that said, of course, there are bureaucratic conflicts. They each have their own staff. They each have their own supporters in the top elite, and there's friction between them at times. But I don't think it extends to the two men who really matter, and that's Medvedev and Putin. So, in short, and this brings us to another question: who's going to be the candidate in 2012, the next presidential election? Is Putin going to come back, as some people think, or is it going to be Medvedev? My answer is it really doesn't matter. Whoever it is, whichever of them it is, and there are other wildcard scenarios that people also talk about, but whichever it is, they're from the same team.
Listen, when you say it doesn't matter, but it doesn't matter for whom. For Medvedev, it matters. And from this point of view, I'm very much going to agree that the relations is totally asymmetrical. Basically, Putin is politically stronger, administratively stronger. I do believe he has a stronger character. The only problem is that removing Medvedev now also has a price for Putin. Because the strange story of the Russian presidential elections is that nevertheless that nothing really happens on the day of the elections. This elections has much more consequences than people believe. If Putin decides to come back, removing Medvedev, first of all, by the way, he should find the good reasons for this. Because the failure of Medvedev is also Putin's failure. This is going to be the failure of the team. But secondly, what is extremely more important, this is the change of the nature of the regime. For the moment, and I do believe this was very important for Putin, he was going according to the constitution, he's keeping room for maneuver, and he's not becoming the hostage of his own system. Because if Putin decides to go back, it means that he's going to look very much like Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan. He should die in power. There is no going to be any way out of this. And I do believe that he's understanding that any type of rule has its own life cycles. Not that there is a real alternative, not that people are excited about somebody else, but people are tired of politicians. People are tired of the status quo. Tunisia is a good example of this. So from this point of view, for somebody like Putin, who remembered also how the Soviet Union collapsed, who hears that he's now starting to be compared to his Brezhnev by his opponents, the basic problem is to keep his flexibility or not. And here's where the change can come. Then you said, okay, but why not simply reappointing Medvedev or re-electing him? The problem is that if Medvedev is going to be re-elected for the next 6 years, this is going to be a different Medvedev. Medvedev is a second term, which is going to be much longer, who's going to be present for the second time. I do believe is going to change part of this constellation of powers in the Russian elite. So nevertheless, that I do believe you are relaxed about who is going to get what. If you're part of this game, if we're not talking about this from Vienna, but we're talking from somewhere in Moscow, especially from the Moscow elite circles, I can imagine that in Russia people are more tense, the elite people, before these elections than some of the Americans before the American elections.
Yeah, well, if Putin were to come back, that would certainly be taken as a signal, both within Russia and outside, of a certain new direction, and most people would not take it as a good signal. But This brings us to the next aspect of this question, which is why Putin and Medvedev are so popular. And when I say it doesn't matter which of them is in power, and when we talk about continuity, that's really talking about if things continue as they have in the past. And for the last 10 years, the president, first Putin and then Medvedev, with Putin as prime minister, both of them have been extraordinarily popular. And I think credible opinion polls bear this out by the Levada Center, which is a very independent and professional polling organization. They get approval ratings of these days around 70% or even higher. So why are they so popular with so many Russians? My argument in the book, The Return, and in other work I've done, is that the popularity of the presidents follows very closely opinion about the performance of the economy. So when people see the economy doing well, they tend to support the president more. When they see the economy collapsing, the ratings of the president also collapse. And statistically, there seems to be a close relationship there. Now, of course, the economy's done tremendously in the last 10 years. Real disposable income of Russians has averaged about 10% growth per year. So it's not that surprising. It's like in many other countries, a good economy buys legitimacy, buys support for those in power. But that might change. And now I think we're at a point where the future of the Russian economy is particularly unclear. It's possible that growth will continue at a reasonably high level. Some people are predicting 4 to 5% for the next few years. It's possible that oil prices will shoot up again, and then Russia's growth might be quite high. But it's also possible that Russia, that the model that's worked so well for so long, could start to fall apart, that economic growth could be very low or even negative. And then, if things continue as they have gone in the last 10 or 20 years, we should expect to see the emergence of more political opposition from various quarters, and the regime trying to react to a situation where suddenly they're not popular, and that's a completely new situation for them.
I agree very much with you, and also being a reader of your book, I'm very much going to agree with the fact that economy really matters. But I don't believe that economy was the only source of popularity of Putin for the last 10 years. And I do believe that here is where the change comes. There were two other very important kind of sources of popularity of Putin, and now for the Putin-Medvedev team. One was the memories of the 1990s. I do believe that Putin was very successful to portray himself as an alternative to the chaos and state weakness of the 1990s. So he managed to portray himself as a total alternative to the Yeltsin period. Nevertheless, that if you look closer, I do believe that there are much more continuity than discontinuity there. And the third, of course, was this very strong appeal to the Russian pride, to the fact that Russia is back, that Russia has returned. All this is there. But what has changed, in my view, after the economic crisis is that first the memories of 1990s are fading away, and people have to start a second thoughts how bad exactly 1990s were. And nevertheless, that of course you have a total control over media and things like this. You have a new generation of people who don't remember who Yeltsin was anymore. I do believe for the first time now the regime is totally dependent on the economic performance. But here it's also strange, because if you see its economic performance, but it's much more redistribution of this economic performance. When Putin basically said that in the next election year, 40 million persons, old people are going for medical tests and things like this. This is very strange. Why you need to be a populist when you're controlling everybody? Why you need to be a populist when you don't have an opposition? But I do believe that this sense that you cannot survive any decline of the incomes of the population is making the regime very nervous. And this explains the fact why the regime is overreacting, especially when seeing people on the street. And I'll go back to my argument from the beginning of our conversation. Experience matters. Putin, much more than Medvedev, he simply fears the street. He remembered the street of 1990s, and he remembered being a KGB officer that when people on the street, you can do nothing. So from this point of view, I do believe that the major problem that the regime is facing is that in a situation of economic crisis, there's going to be this temptation to overreact, to be too tough, to show that you're in charge, and in a certain way, the very reaction of the government can provoke a political crisis.
Well, that's definitely possible, and I think you're absolutely right that the basis of support for the regime has become even more economic, and also that the leadership is terrified of what might happen if the economy were to deteriorate. And we see in the global financial crisis the last couple of years, they have really increased spending dramatically in the attempt to keep people from feeling the effects. So GDP fell by nearly 8% in 2009. But they managed to keep personal disposable income of Russians rising. So it rose about 2.3%, both in 2008 and 2009, and it rose about 4% last year. Pensions have been dramatically increased, last year by more than 35% in real terms. So clearly they're very worried about the potential for people to feel the economic crisis and stop supporting them. And it seems to me, I agree that if there were any other bases for support of Putin, and certainly other factors did matter as well as the economy, there are much fewer today. The support remains very broad because they've managed to cushion the population from the economic crisis. But if it's broad, it's also thin, and thinner and thinner. So people are not anymore, they don't like Putin as much as they used to. In fact, they're getting tired of seeing him on TV all the time, and there's exhaustion with the current regime. So it's a kind of conditional support, tentative support, and that could change perhaps more rapidly if the if the detonator of an economic crisis were to come about. Now, as you say, Ivan, they seem to be overreacting to street protests, which are called by groups which don't have very broad support in the population, arresting opposition leaders. Boris Nemtsov, the Democratic leader, was put in jail for 15 days, presumably as some sort of warning recently. And why are they so sensitive? I think you're absolutely right that Putin looks back at the experience of how the Soviet Union disintegrated. And the message there was that it's a very dangerous moment when street protests start to get beyond a certain mass and when they start to spread. And it's very easy to let that moment pass, and then suddenly it's too late to even use force effectively to stop the ball from rolling.
But from this point of view, it's very interesting to notice that, of course, you have this ritual pressure on the Moscow liberals, which go 300, 500 on the streets protesting, much more keeping Russia alive in the world's democratic imagination. But for the first time, where you have this anti-immigrant, xenophobic rally with 10,000 people, and these 10,000 people were not the usual demonstrators. And they're coming as a result of an ad hoc crisis, the killing of one of their friends. You can see the police wasn't effective. And the government does not do works to react. I do believe part of the problem of the government is that, of course, the government prefers to arrest people like Nemtsov. And they can live with the fact that they're going to be, after that, a press conference and a statement from the American State Department. But the real problem and the real fear of the government is that I do believe Putin and people around him, more than anybody else, knows how ungovernable the country is. What's happening in the region, who is really controlling the situation. And basically what can happen on the street and whom you can rely or not rely on. And here corruption is becoming a major issue, but not simply because the regime believes that it should not be corrupt enough. They have nothing against their own corruption. The problem is that corrupt government is very unpredictable government. You don't know this policeman from whom they're getting money. Are they ready to do on the street what you expect from them? This is why I still insist that nevertheless that on the surface you have this very normal government which reacts very predictably, which basically is not different than you can expect. There is this huge anxiousness and insecurity that makes the Russian government much more unpredictable both in domestic and international politics than you can expect basically reading part of the data.
Well, I think this insecurity is quite rational. And I think they're right to worry that if the street protests go from 5,000 to 100,000, very quickly they can pass a point of no return. And as a result, they're worried and they don't quite know what to do, especially, as you mentioned, with this new this riot in December in central Moscow, when supporters of a Russian football fan who was apparently killed by someone of Chechen nationality, when they rioted because the suspects had been released by the police. This was something I think that the Kremlin and ruling circles were not prepared for, and they don't quite know what to do about Russian nationalism and xenophobic nationalism. They're not sure if this is something that they can try to co-opt and moderate, that they could even use as a source of support if economic conditions deteriorate, or if it's something that they really have to worry about. And I think it's a very dangerous game to try and either support or do nothing about xenophobic nationalism. And it's something they'll have to grapple with in the next year or two.
No, very much agree, because in a certain way the very institutions that should allow the Russian multicultural, multi-religious, multi-ethnic society to live together are the institutions that are making it much more difficult and basically accelerating this. If you talk to people in Russia, they're going to tell you that the moment in which ethnic nationalism is becoming stronger is when a kid goes to the army. And basically he's going to be beaten and he's going to be protected because of his ethnicity. And I do believe that these institutions, which normally used to be the institutions of integration, are in a major crisis, and we're talking about the cultural crisis. You don't know what to do. I don't believe it's a Russian problem only. I do believe from this point of view, Russia probably is telling us more about the world to come than many other countries. But as a result of it, I do believe that very much looking back, very much being interested in and fearing things that look like the Orange Revolution or something like this, the Russian leadership is losing the momentum in which the former Soviet time created cement of society is now going away. And you have a new generation of post-Soviet youth from different ethnic groups coming together, and the only place that they have been meeting each other is on the football stadiums, basically fighting each other.
Yes. Okay. Well, on that note, let me pose a question that I promised that we would get to, which is Russia today a democracy? Is it an authoritarian state? As I understand it, you think it's neither.
Yeah. My basic position is in a country in which you know who's going to be, you cannot basically decide who's going to be a president or mayor on the elections. This country cannot come to the simple definition of democracy. On the other side, I don't believe that Russia can be viewed as a classical autocracy, and all these type of comparisons between Putin regime and the Soviet regime are very misleading. This current government is not based on fear only, and I do believe that it's very easy to believe that people simply support Putin because of fear, that all public opinion polls are manipulated. This is very easy for our kind of democratic minds to believe that if there are going to be different television channels, and if Putin is not going to be there, all Russians are going to become liberals overnight. But this is not the reality. For me, what is extremely important is this definition between democracy, this opposition between democracy and autocracy is much more hiding than revealing when it comes up to Russia. And from this point of view, it's much more interesting to focus on the nature of the post-Soviet Russian society. Is there a political community in Russia? How to define it? On the state weakness in Russia, the incoherent nature of the Russian bureaucracies, which are fighting each other, and because there is no political interest. In a way, the bureaucratic world is more important than anything else. So I don't believe that Russia is democracy, but I do believe that if we try to understand what Russia is, we should not simply come with a simple autocratic explanation, which are telling us the story of a very kind of fearful leader, and those who obey simply because of fear.
Right, I very much agree with that. It's certainly not a traditional authoritarian state, insofar as there is such a thing as a traditional authoritarian state. It's a regime in which the national elections these days are certainly manipulated in fairly blatant ways. Nevertheless, everybody believes, and I think correctly, that Putin and Medvedev would get elected with a landslide still up to this point in a completely fair and honest election. So it's a system in which the government is legitimate not because of the elections, which are viewed as flawed and really undermined by the government, but because there's a basic public opinion in support of the president that he could win an honest election if there were one.
I very much want to agree with you here. As you know, we're working with colleagues from the New York University on a book on Russia, which is very much wanting to make this simple point. Russia is imitating democracy, but Russia is also imitating authoritarianism. If you see to the logic of the Russian elections from the point of view of those who rule Russia, you're going to see that for them the elections are like what military exercise for the generals. On one side, it's good because your side is always going to win. But secondly, this is the only way to understand who of your officers is going to deliver. Can you bring people to the ballot boxes? Are you really in the control of the situation? So in the presidential elections, you're not choosing the president, but some governors who lost their job. So I believe it's important. On the other side, when people talk about persecution of journalists or when you say the Khodorkovsky case, yes, it's a very strong imitation also of a powerful authoritarian state. You have the feeling that Putin can put all the businesses in prison, but in fact he cannot. And the very interesting story with the Khodorkovsky case is that in 2003, it played a very important symbolic role to show how strong and powerful Putin is, and he very much responded to the public expectations to go against the oligarchs. But the longer Khodorkovsky stayed in prison, and the longer people were starting to understand that it's not against the oligarchs, it's against a very specific oligarch who is a personal enemy of Putin and whose property have been redistributed to some of Putin's friends, I do believe everything that used to be a sign of Putin's strength a decade ago, now more and more is starting to become his problem. And from this point of view, Khodorkovsky is a very good example of this. The Khodorkovsky case is in the news because recently he was sentenced at the end of the second case to another 14 years, 6 of which he will still serve. And the case itself was very far from an example of impartial justice. The allegations against him, I think, were that he had personally stolen all the oil produced by his company for 3 years. The former minister of the economy said that this could not have happened, and the judge ignored that. So it was a trial which was sort of brazenly unfair. And the question is what this means for Russian society. In addition, obviously, to what it means for Khodorkovsky, what it means for the Russian regime. I'm not convinced that it really has much effect. I understand and I agree with what you're saying, Ivan, that
that people have become much more cynical about this case over time. Those who pay any attention, which I should say is a minority, are less and less convinced that there was anything legitimate in this prosecution of Khodorkovsky. So voters, Russians are cynical. They view it as a personal vendetta. At the same time, they don't, I think, the mass of Russians, and this is certainly not the liberal circles in Moscow and St. Petersburg, but the mass of the people, I think, still have very little sympathy for Khodorkovsky, whom they view as a billionaire who made his money in questionable ways.
No, here I'll agree, but my major point was not about even how popular Khodorkovsky is, but basically Putin is losing room for maneuvering. This is true with respect to his friends, this is true with respect to his enemies. He does not have option anymore with respect to Khodorkovsky. He should keep him in prison because it looks as if Khodorkovsky goes out of prison. This is defeat for Putin, and the same illustrates his relations with Medvedev. He does not know what to do with Medvedev. Because if Medvedev is going to stay, is this going to be also perceived as Putin's weakness? And I'm saying this nevertheless, I want to make a point which we have been talking with you before. I do believe part of the stability of the regime is coming from two sources that are very kind of unexpected, and they're not specific for Russia, but in my view tells us more about the world in which we live as a whole. I do believe that the fact that you have an open borders in Russia, on one level, this open borders is making people kind of more free, they can see how the others are living. You can expect that demand for change and demand for democracy is going to increase when you have these 10 million Russians going outside of the country on tourism or business.
22 million.
22 million, yeah, 22 million. So, but then, strangely enough, you have this middle class of tourists, which in my view, when they look around, and if they don't like what they see, they're much more ready to act like a consumer than basically as a political activist. They don't have time, patience, or even hope to change the system. They're much more changing the country. So if you're really desperate with the situation in Russia, instead of going on the protest, instead of going on the street, you go to the airport. So there was basically this old joke that there are at least two exits of the situation in Russia. One is Sheremetyevo, and the other is the Modelo airports. And I do believe this is very important because this is at least for me one of the explanation. While nevertheless the regime is not very much popular, you don't have this level of political pressure. You don't feel this pressure on the government for political change. Comparing with the 1980s, not only the government, but even in this type of a Moscow society, the pressure for political reforms is not very strong. And my second point will be about the non-ideological nature of the regime. People believe that this makes the regime weaker because the regime does not have any god to refer to. Basically, they have the behavior of the corporate CEOs. In some way, they have also the same profits, honestly speaking. But from this point of view, of course, on one level, it looks like weakness, but on the other, on what language to attack Putin's regime? What it means to tell them that they're crooks. They never said that they're not crooks. In a certain way, they're very much proud to show how rich they are. If you see all these state officials who also headed the big companies, this is really amazing. I remember in the days of the crisis, one of the important things that happened is one of the important lifestyle magazines in Russia each year is asking young Russian girls whom they want to marry. And before they always wanted to marry oligarchs. And when the crisis came, they switched. They said you basically want to marry a high government official because the money are the same, but the risk is lower. So I do believe from this point of view, this is exactly the non-ideological nature of the regime and the open borders that create a certain room for maneuvering for government, which, at least in my reading, lost parts of its initial appeal to the public.
Yes, well, clearly being non-ideological leaves you with somewhat more room for maneuver in opportunistic ways. And your argument, Ivan, is that when you have exit, when people can leave the country easily, then it reduces the pressure for what Hirschman called voice, pressing for political change at home. And I'm not quite sure that I completely agree with that, because I think when you have exit, you also feel more secure in pressing for political change at home, because you know if the worst happens, you can always go to Sheremetyevo and take a flight to Paris or London. But I think I'm struck by a paradox listening to us talk here, because on the one hand, we're saying this regime feels very insecure, that its support rests on economic performance, which suddenly looks quite unpredictable and maybe unstable. And on the other hand, we're saying there's no pressure for change coming from society, because people are consumerist, apolitical, and they can go abroad. And I think there's a bit of tension between those two positions. I think what could lead to political change is an economic deterioration, which would then prompt not immediately political or ideologically political resistance or opposition, but just outrage, people going into the streets demanding that their pensions be paid or increased, and more protests about corruption and all the different aggravating circumstances of daily life in Russia, which you suddenly start to notice more if your wages are going down rather than going up. So I can see not a kind of unified, politically cohesive movement coming out of this, but a whole myriad of different disgruntled minorities converging on the state, and the state in its insecurity, in its lack of ideology, in its lack of conviction, not quite knowing what to do, other than to sort of try to crack down and intimidate, probably in ineffective ways, or else to keep trying to buy off the support. The outcome of that is quite is obviously unpredictable.
I'll agree with you. It is very difficult to predict, especially in the future. But my major argument is, and this is where I very much basically I was not so much arguing with you, but there are people who believe that when authoritarianism is in crisis, what comes naturally is liberal democracy, because this is how it happened in Poland, this should happen also in Russia. First of all, I do believe not because of the quality of the regime and not because of a popular support, but first, decay is always an option. And decay is especially an option for societies which fear change because they have a kind of a very catastrophic experience with change. Don't forget that when people decide to go on the street, they always remember what happened when they have been on the street for the last time. And I do believe that this is one of the reasons why a regime which, for example, in Russia, Putin and Medvedev has a good popular support, but if you see the institutions which they present, if you go to all other around them, ministers, local authorities and others, the trust is very low. So the very strange story is, if you like so much your president and prime minister, why you don't like the way they're governing you? And the problem is there could be major change. There could be implosion also in Russian society, which means that we can have escalation at this level of ungovernability. On the other side, a kind of a different alternative can come, and in the way Putinism was not very much seen in the middle of the 1999, probably there are new forces and new faces that can come into Russian politics. So I do believe this is good about the future. Everything can happen.
Right. As Tocqueville said about the French Revolution, when it came, it was predictable but unexpected. I think if there is regime change in Russia, we'll look back and we'll see that the new force that emerged was there all along. We just didn't notice it. On that note, let's call it a day, and thank you very much, Ivan.
Thanks. Bye.